Hello and welcome to Interaction Design, Modeling and Materials Module 1 Tutorial 8. In this final module tutorial, we are specifically looking at how to publish your 3D models for your final design submission. We're focusing on digital publishing. We have been using Cinema 4D throughout this series of tutorials. As mentioned before, C4D is a great tool for modeling, texturing, rendering, and animating 3D models. But as modeling software, it is a development tool. You create projects and export files as required, but it doesn't directly publish your files. It has no way for viewers to share your files other than rendering them as images. This is where publishing comes in. Publishing means opening access to your designs so they can be shared. Digital publishing means available over the web. So our focus here is to consider different ways to share your designs over the web. Others like Spark AR are great at letting you add your 3D designs into interactive apps available to meta users through Facebook and Instagram. Adobe Aero is another AR tool allowing you to share and deploy your own 3D models and designs triggered with a QR code. Each of these tools has strengths and weaknesses. Each has strong use cases that can help you decide your best choice for your own projects. And mostly, each of these are proprietary and use specific file types. Using each of them has a learning curve. We will be focusing on exporting digital files to Google Model Viewer. Google's Viewer tool is capable of publishing simple AR/VR scenes. The only interaction is rotating or zooming in on the model. Every file you export from Cinema 4D should be tested before you import it into whichever direction you choose. There are simple online tools to test a 3D file, making sure textures load before you import them somewhere and have to figure out why it's not working. The process is the same every time. Model and texture with a development tool, export and test, import to publishing tool. The easiest tool for testing is a web tool. Depending on the file type, it's best to Google the file type with the words Model Viewer. Let's go through the process so you can see it in action. So here we are back in Cinema 4D. We have our drum scene. We have it the way we left it with our lights and our plane and all of these different pieces. So very different than the Totadile, the Sculpt where you're working from a box and all of your polygons are connected. These are a whole bunch of different interconnected things and several different materials that are attached to those sort of different objects that are intersecting. So there's a couple things that we need to do as we are going to prep our scene. One of the first things is we're going to take everything that has to do with the actual object, and I'm going to select them all, and I'm going to copy them, and we're going to go into a new scene, and I'm going to paste them. So that there's nothing here other than this, it's just these pieces. The next piece I'm going to do, I'm going to take a look at these and just see which ones, and I'm pretty sure all of them are going to need to be remeshed. So why do we remesh things? So if I go to display and we get a nice close look here, some of these are fine. Like in fact, the actual shape of our cylinder doesn't have a huge amount of meshes. There are a few problems, as it's a little hard to see some of these. So the problem with this object right off the top for us to do any editing or anything with it is that none of these have been converted into poly shapes. In fact, this is still in many ways a parametric object. We can kind of go in and still look at it and see these individual components that were made to do this. But even with that, we can get close enough and we can start to see a little bit of the problem. And I don't know if the camera is going to show this really easily, but if you can see those lines, there is a texture, there's no doubt, but there's lines there that are actually making this difficult. One way that we can take a look at the sort of density of our polygons or the shape of our polygons is in display. If we just go to lines, you can now get a bit of a sense of the polygons that we're dealing with here. And there are areas like in how we built our lathe of our drum cylinder, and you can see that there's not a lot there. There are some problems with it, but there's not a lot there. When I say there's problems with it, the main problem I'm pointing at is actually the shape of the bottom how you can see that there are these long triangular polygons, and those are really not optimal. We want nice square ones if we can, and in fact those are going to be duplicated up at the top. It's just a little difficult to see them because it's the exact same problem that's happening on the top lathe that we built, is that it has the same exact kind of polygons. On top of that, the other issue, and you can see how dark and dense all of these are, that's all because of the polygons. There are so many of them, right, that they're actually creating a density and making it look black, when in fact that's just because they are polygons. Now, what does that mean? It means there's way too much math that's going on here, and when we export this as a digital file, it's going to be far bigger than it needs to be. Okay, so let's go back to our garage shading, and we can kind of see, and this is what I'm talking about, this these triangular polygons, and if I move that one, you can kind of see that it's the same thing underneath. So optimally, that would not exist. So one of the ways that we can adjust that is actually using one of our modifiers, which is the remesh. And if we add the remesh, let's use the remesh, for instance, on this surface in particular, because it will really show how that's going to look. So I've selected it. Now also, just as I'm looking, notice where, and it doesn't matter particularly for this object, but notice that its axis is way down here. If I want to move that axis, I need to select the enable axis button, move it up, and that's a better spot for it. Go back, or else I won't be able to then do anything else. If I was to now take this lathe and I'm going to drop it into that remesh, and now the remesh tool, you can see, has actually remeshed that surface, right? And if I select the remesh tool, we can actually decide how much density we want to have there. And you basically want to, and you can see that now I've gotten it so low that it's affected the radius, and it's far too simplified. So I'm going to increase that. That's not bad. If I go, you can see that we can actually go way too complicated and add, and if we do this though, we add a nice smoothness as well. So, and this is much easier as a mesh for Cinema 4D to deal with. Let's get this down to, let's say, 150 isn't bad. So we're going to do 150% mesh density, which is higher density but better design. Okay, and adaptiveness, you can see that we can actually adjust the adaptiveness if we want to have it kind of adhere or change the shape of the object more or less. I'm going to stick with 40 on that. Okay, so this will be the new remesh, and what I would need to do there is when I select remesh is press C, so that now I've turned that into a poly shape. So you can see that now that the lathe is like this, I could go in and grab any one of these and do what I want with it. I don't want to do anything with it, but this way I could go in and edit that if I choose to. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to add every single one of these objects into a remesh, and as I do, you're going to be able to see that mesh change. I'm going to select all of the uprights here, and I'm going to try something a little different. I'm going to add them into a group object, so it throws them into one null, and I'm going to add a remesh, and I'm going to see about doing all of them. Now at this stage, my computer has suddenly frozen, and if you notice down in the bottom corner that it is working, and these meshes in particular of these knots are so complex, and as it is remeshing, it comes down to how fast your CPU is. So I have a fairly new GPU. My CPU is a bit dated. If you do this on the school computers, it should actually go pretty quick, but depending on your home computer, this might take some time. I can actually not do anything right now, and when that happens with Cinema 4D, when it gets busy doing something, and that's going to happen a few times today as I'm showing you this stuff, it's best to stop clicking and let Cinema 4D work in the background. So you can see that with everything now remeshed, that there are a couple issues. The one is that by remeshing the knots that I had made here using the cloning tool, that it's had an issue with specifically getting them reset. Not that one. Not that one. There it is. So I'm going to just get rid of those. Okay, so now you can see that I have that mesh reset. So our next step here is going to be selecting everything. And we want this now to be one object, not all these individual objects. So we are going to go to Object. We're going to go to Connect Objects and Delete. And you can see that that's going to set all of the objects into our one object, a poly object, and it's added all three of the material. Let's next go into our UV edit now that it's one object. And let's select, and yeah, this is not what we want a UV map to look like. So in fact, as soon as I erase that UV map, yeah, it's erased our textures there. So what we need to do is we need to create a new UV map of this now that it's one object, and I'm going to select the edge tool. And at first when I go to UV unwrap, it's not going to work properly. Usually it'll pop up an error like this. So it's gone through the unwrap process perfectly. So and you can see that I just needed to give it time, and what's happened is my computer froze up while it was working because it's taking so much of the CPU. Now you can see that, you know, especially in compared to any of the other UV mapping we might have done with the Totadiles, that because it's not created as a box or a sculpt, it's a lot of pieces, right? So these are the pieces that we're going to work with, and we now have a UV map. But what we will find is when we go back to our model that our at the moment, our textures are not aligning properly. So what we need to do is go back into our textures. Right, so right now we're set to UV mapping. Let's set this to cubic. There we go. So by going into cubic, I can go in and start now to realign these textures the way that I want them to be. So it looks like it might have rotated them. Let's see. That may work. Stretched out. Yeah, that looks pretty good stretched out actually. Okay, it's not exactly like it was before, but it's definitely giving us that nice sort of rope kind of look. So we're going to try to stick with that one and see how it works. Okay. And we go back to our material so we can see it that way. Let's try rendering it. Yeah, not too bad. That's not too bad. It's not exactly like it was before, but it's pretty good as we go forward. Okay, so our next step now is that, you know, we have these three materials. You can't really have three separate materials this way when you export. I want to change the name of this object. I want this to be called drum. All right, so now it's drum, and I actually want to change the name of these materials. So this material is going to be called leather, and this material is going to be called rope, and this material is going to be called wood. And that way they'll be easier to identify down the road. Okay, now I'm going to go in and I'm going to go to Bake Object. I'm using the normals, keep UVs, replace objects. I've increased my size from 512 to 2048. It's always better to use a square, so same width and height. I've changed my format to JPEG because it's more universal for working with 3D models. And the most important part is I have added a selected folder, which is on my desktop, and I've called the folder drum. And now I can bake that, and it's going to bake that into the folder, and you're going to see that it's going to have all these specific files, and it's maybe not easy to see that. So let me pull up that folder and we can take a look at what's inside it. So I'm going to pull this over, and you can see that we have this folder called drum, and I've got drum normal and drum surface color in there right now. Okay. Now what we are going to need to do is go into this object, and we're going to want to now make sure that it is connected properly. Actually, we're going to go to our material editor. You can see we have normal here. So let's do two things. We are connected to drum normal, so that's working. And if that was working perfectly though, we would have, and we do, it is showing. Okay, then you know what, we can just stick with the normals the way they are. That worked out good. And we've baked it. We have all those. Let me see if we can get away with erasing those three. And I believe we don't need those tags. Looking okay so far. Okay, so our next step is we're going to, now that we have our entire file system here, let's export it. So I'm going to go to File, Export. Now with the GLTF GLB file format, which there's a lot of different file formats, we've talked about a few of them. You want to go first to the little cog wheel so that you can decide some things. So for instance, with materials, we want textures on both sides, normals. Flip Z is often something that you need to do for, it depends on what the other program out there is going to have as up, but Cinema 4D offers that because of the way that it uses the Z axis. Make sure you include your UVs, and we're going to press OK, and we're going to call this, whoops, let's call this drum. And you know what, I've been working with a few of them, so let's just call this one for now drum 11. And it's going to export it. And now what we want to do is we want to go and test that. So this viewer, if I go back one step, all I've done here is in Google, I've done a search for 3D model viewer, and the very top one, this 3dviewer.net, is the one that we want. And you can see what's powerful about this viewer, and I want you to have access to it, is that you can test different file types. OBJ is a file type we will be using in Project 3. STL is, of course, a file type that you've already used. GLTF is the file that we're using right now. FBX is a file type that I believe is used for Spark AR. So why are we using GLTF? So GLTF are extremely small files, and the materials are embedded in them, and that means you just need one file and it'll work. So I'm going to pull up a folder. Okay, so I pulled my file into this folder, and I've got this one file. So let's test it here. So I'm going to just drag it right into the screen. It's going to visualize the model, and there we go. And it doesn't have the best lighting, and it's really kind of operating a bit slow, which is a thing. But you can see that there are some normal maps going on there, and all of our textures have put on it. Now the online 3D viewer is not the final place that we're doing this. We're just using this as a sort of a simple test, and a place where you now know you can kind of go and check things. And if there are things that are missing, like if the normals are missing, you can actually go into files and it'll show if there are any other files here. So if you're using a OBJ, we also have like a material file with a whole bunch of, different files that are added with it, and those will all be there. And this is the power of the GLB or GLTF, is that it's simple like this. So I'm going to look up Google Model Viewer, and at first I'm just going to go to their first one here, and you can see that it explains it's an easily display interactive 3D models on the web and in AR. And we will be using this for AR, a little bit of Project 2, and I'm going to drag that right on. And now we get a sense for how this is going to work. And we can see that, in fact, our reflectance is so high that, in fact, this doesn't look like rope. It looks like some kind of rubber cord. The wood on the is okay. It's fine. The light is a little strong. It gives you a code snippet that is interesting but not completely practical. So using the Google Model Viewer editor, the web editor, is a great way of confirming that your model will load, that the textures will load, that the normals will load, that everything is connected. But this is not a final project. In order to use the Google Model Viewer, you need to be able to use something similar to this. Have a code snippet that's in an HTML file that you can change the models that are in it, that you can then upload to your Phoenix server, and that way you can have multiple models through their own individual links. So what does that look like? So I have already prepared a little bit, Visual Studio Code, and a folder. So I've created a folder, and I've just called it P1 Drum. Project 1 Drum, and you can see that it just has an assets folder and an index HTML. So we have our assets, environments, and models. And then we have our index itself. So jumping over to, actually, you know what, I'll close, or I'll reduce that. I'm gonna pull this aside, and of course now we have our index. So let's take a look at this code. Actually, let me drag that back. So in the code, you can see that it is a very short, like that's it. It's 37 lines of code, and it's not really code. It's a HTML document. You can see that it has a title. I'm just calling it Model Viewer. Then in style, you can see it's only set to like 500 by 500, not very big. The script, it's connected to the Google Model Viewer.min.js, so you leave that script there. You can always change the size if you chose to. The alt text is just drum model created in Cinema 4D, and here I'm going to change the model into drum 11. So it's assets models drum11.glb, and then don't worry about the AR mode. So this WebXR Scene Viewer quick look is because Google Model Viewer is made to test AR, and this is just a way of confirming your model is loading okay, but it works great as a publishing tool for us then. The environment is set to legacy. Now, in the assets, you might have noticed this environments tab, and I do have some HDR models in here. HDR are lighting types, and we might deal with HDR at some point, but in the meantime, I've just kind of left them in there, okay? But just leave the environment image to legacy. The exposure will allow you to make the the lighting of the model higher or lower. It ranges from like 0.1 up to a full 1. So if this was like this, like shadow intensity, you could have set this to 1, but it would be brighter. And the same thing, shadow intensity, you could set it to 0.5 or 0.25 or whatever, but 1 is its maximum. And then camera controls, this is so that you can use the mouse to drag the, like dragging the model around. And really you're not dragging the model around, you're dragging the camera around. And that's it. So right now it's set to this drum 11. I'm going to save it, and let's go live. Always takes a second for things to load up. And there it is. It's kind of over that way. I wonder if I can drag that over this way a little bit for you. So dragging it around is possible just by clicking and dragging. There's a chance that my recording program will crash if I do, because it pulls so much of the video memory to do that right now. I'll leave that right towards the very end. So what I'll just mention is that by building it this way and using the code this way, it means that you can use the code and add individual models, name the file folders, different things, upload them to your Phoenix server, and you have individual models then that you can easily link to your project and to your Project 1 deliverables. And that way you can show off and showcase your digitally published 3D models. Next, let's jump in and go back and do the same thing with the DVD. Then we'll go and work our way to the 2 different Totadiles. So we can also use this as a chance to confirm that our DVD model is going to export properly. So we can, of course, in our cube model here, let's check our UV edit. Okay, and that should be correct. So now when I go into my UV edit, I can UV unwrap. Oh, that did not unwrap very nicely. But as long as we have the main artwork there, I'm not too worried about the rest. I wish this had, but you know why? It's because they're all still attached in there. So there's some connection that's still happening that's giving, but not across the artwork. So we've got that set. So now in our cube, let's go to, let's bake object, and I'm going to try leaving this at 512 by 5. Actually, no, I'm going to move it up to 1. So I'm going to do this at 1024 by 1024. And, keep UVs. We don't have any normals. And the rest should be okay. We might have to do replace objects, but I don't think so. Actually, I'm going to do it. And then we want to, I'm just going to put this, let me create a new folder on my desktop. DVD. Actually, I'm going to call it, let's call it DVD for now. And here, select that folder. Actually, yeah, that's fine. It makes no difference. We'll throw it in there. Bake. Great. And you can see that it created our textures and we have all our colors, and so everything looks like it's going to work just fine. Now this of course is more necessary for eventually for the OBJ. Now it is interesting that none of the material tags have attached to our cube. That is kind of odd. And did it, whoops, let's go back to model mode. Let's look at our material editor. Did it? Yeah, it created it. So let's, for these, I guess we're going to erase those and drag the material onto the cube so it's there. And I'm a little concerned that there's no UV map showing on it. And even though it's all working perfectly fine, I do find that a little disconcerting. So let's go back to our UV edit. Oh, there it is. The material and the font tag are showing there. I don't know why it... Oh, I guess just because when we converted it... Okay, so we don't need to have that material on there. That's fine. Okay. So there's our cube object. And let me... Yep. Okay. So let's export this as a GLTF. And I'm going to put it into that new DVD folder. And I'm not going to call it Nomad anymore. I'm just going to call it DVD1. Save it there. In our model editor, let's grab that. Let's try that. It's very small. It's very small. And the textures are teeny, 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 tiny. Oh, no, they've just popped in. So it's very small, and it has the plane on it, right? So this would be, again, a chance to... oh, and that's why. It's small because it's fitting the whole plane in, okay? So, in fact, that would be a great time to go back here. Let's either get rid of the plane or... And I do want to get rid of the plane, so we can look at all 6 sides. So I'm going to erase the plane. We can keep the lights, I suppose, for now. Let's save that, and let's... Oops, wrong cube. Let's go to Model. Let's go to File, Export, and this time we will call it DVD2, and we're going to put it there. So let's go back to our model editor, and let's pull in that model. There we go. Okay, so now we've got the model and can turn it around and see all the different sides. And that worked out pretty great, actually. And the next step, of course, would be to add this to our code, change the name in the HTML, add, make sure that this is in the actual model itself. And maybe that's what I'll do. I'll add all of the models into the project so everybody can kind of look at all of the models that we've worked on through these tutorials. So next, let's jump into one of the Totadiles and see what we can do there. So here we are back in our Totadile sculpt, and this is of course the Totadile that I was using for STL. And if we go to you can see that there's no textures on this one. I'm not sure what happens if we do drag some textures on it. Yeah, that one's not going to work. How about that one? No. So these no longer align to the mesh that is on there, so I'm just going to get rid of that. But I do want to use this one over one of those earlier ones with the painted version, only because for this rendered one I actually wanted to be able to just create some colors in my materials and add them right onto the polygons instead of going in and painting them. But either way, however you want to do yours is going to be fine. So I went ahead, and you can see that basically what I did is I first of all went and I copied this, went to a new file, pasted it in so it's all by itself, and then I went in and I made a material for the surface of the whole body, and then I went piece by piece. I went in and let's get our lines. Will it give them? Okay, so I went in, selected all of these polygons here, dragged yellow onto them, went over to all these ones in here, created this sort of orangey pink texture, dragged it here. Same thing with the spines. Went in and selected them individually, or grouped them really, and then dragged the material on them, and then so the eye was probably the only part that I went in and did a little bit more work. And if I pull this down, you can see that I selected a group of these, and I actually went and did the inset again, so you can see that it created this little bit of a line around it and inset it. I tried creating another fit to circle there. It did not want to do it. It created a really nasty big huge circle, and it wouldn't work properly. And then I thought, you know what, the language of Totadile has this nice digital thing. So what I did is I just used the eye, which has like a bit of white on one side and red on the other, and just decided to play with it this way. So it's almost, they're just opposites in that way. And if I render that, you can see that it's really pretty. It's a really cool little eye. So I'm really happy with this one. And of course, this is the most interpreted version. This is not what the plushie really looks like, but it was kind of a fun sculpt to do nonetheless. And I thought it would be still good to show you guys. Now, what hasn't been done here, as you can see, first of all, I'm not sure that the mesh is correct. And we're just going to kind of pop in, and it is a bit of a nightmare. And you can see the way that it's subdivided it. And has it subdivided it evenly? It has. And you know what? Because it has, I don't know if that's going to be too worrisome then. But what I am going to do is I'm going to try to go in here and delete that one. And we're going to try to unwrap it, and it'll give us that. We'll go back in and see if it'll, no, it doesn't want to do it. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a couple of quick lines on here so that I don't end up with this as my mesh. Okay, and then as soon as I get that sort of subdivided, I will show you guys exactly where it is. So maybe just to show you how I'm doing a bit of this, I am on my edge mode, and in select I've selected loop selection, and what that means is instead of having to go and do the whole thing, I can then select that entire loop, because I actually do want the entire loop of this one cutting sort of halfway all the way down like that. I can now go in and adjust that, or I can leave that just the way it is. I think just to test it, I might leave it like that and just see how our mesh looks. yeah, before I go further, I want to just see how that mesh looks. And if you're wondering how I selected that as the center, whoops, I first went into my symmetry tool, and that was so I could find the middle. All right, but I don't want to be on my symmetry tool. I just want to be able to select the center one. Now we'll go back to UV edit, and using that, let's UV unwrap, and I can live with that. Fit to canvas. I can absolutely live with that. It's not perfect. I mean, they're not all the same size and everything, but you know what? That will work just fine for what I'm doing here. Okay, so in my Totadile, I'm then going to go to Object, and we're going to bake the object. And 1024 by 1024. Let's change that to JPEG, keep UVs, replace objects, and I'm going to create a new folder as well, and we're going to call that Totadile text. We're just going to call it Totadile text. Then I'm going to go in and find Totadile text, and that's where we're going to select and bake it. So now we've got those, and I think that's probably good. It might be worthwhile to make those larger, but let's see how that might work out for us. Now you can see also in our window that it's created a lot of these polygons. I think I'm going to try to get rid of all of those. So now we've got this nice clean little file with our one material. There's no normals on it. Let me just make sure. I mean, it should be, but go back to model. Because of the way I've got this set up, I don't have a lot of real estate. Right, there we go. And we are set to, yep, so all of that should be perfectly fine. All right, now let's try exporting this to GLB. And let's throw that in that same like Totadile text folder that we just created. All right, now let's test this when we go back to our Google model viewer. And there we are. You can drag it around. That turned out nice, really cute. Perfect. So this one is now ready to go as well to be exported for final project. If I wanted to go in now, and now that I see what it looks like and I wanted to adjust any of the colors, because remember, whatever the colors are when you're building them in Cinema 4D, when you publish, it's very different. It'd be no different if you're making a book or a calendar and the cover of your book, the color that you have it on Photoshop or Illustrator is not going to be the same as when you print. And that's why you print a copy to assess it. No different when we did the 3D print of the STL, and you assess it, and then if it needs to be reprinted, you do it again. So here you'd be able to then to go in and decide, you know, is this color accurate? Is this color accurate? And from there, make your final decisions. Okay, so next we're going to jump into our last Totadile, take a look at what could be fixed or changed in that one, check our mesh, and export it again here, and then we'll be done. So here we are looking at our last model that we're going to work on, and I thought about going and doing similar to the other Totadile, which would be using the more, maybe the one that I added a bit of the geometry into the eye. But then I thought, you know what? This one has the texture in it, and in fact, looking at how that works as an exported model is actually more important at this stage. So this is the one we're going to use. I copied it from another, I think from over here, copied it from here. But again, you don't want to have lots of models in your window or in your object manager when you're doing this. So I've brought it in here by itself. You can see that it, again, is using the same process of using the materials set right into the polygon. So I don't have one that I'm exporting that is painted, but it'll work exactly the same once you have your mesh and you've painted it. It'll already have that step done. You can see in the window then that it's not a baked object, and I don't see a UV tag on this one, which means we are going to have to set a UV tag on it. And I'm not sure if that same method is going to work for us, but I would like to try it, just because even though it's not the best way to do a mesh, I have to admit, it's nice and quick at this stage, and so without going in and like cutting around the mouth and cutting all down the... Let's try this one for now and see where it goes. So UV edit, and we're going to go to unwrap, and we've got those two, and now let's fit it to canvas. Great. So now I'm going to go to our object, and let's bake the object. I'm going to set this one to 2048 by 2048, and I think I want to have a new folder for this one, so let's do a new folder, and I'm going to call this one Totadile2 text, and then in here let's look for Totadile2 text. Perfect, and select it. And I think keep UVs, replace objects. We don't have any normals. If we did, we could, keep trying to. It'd be interesting to add fur maybe to this one, But for now, let's just make sure everything's going to work. So we're going to bake it. There's our textures, which definitely look a little weird. But if it works, it works. So I'm going to close that. Again, let's get rid of all these poly tags. If when you remove them, something goes wrong, then certainly you can change it. Got my Fong up as high as it can, so it'll be nice and smooth. If I wanted it to be, more like a low poly, I could do that. I'm going to keep it up for now. And let's go to then export our GLB. We're going to call this Totadile. I've been calling it 6. I'm going to call this one Totadile 6. Let's actually put it in that same folder, which will work fine for what we're doing. Let's go to our model editor. We still have our other Totadile on there. Let's drag our new one on and see how that works. Like a charm. Perfect. So now we know that all of our models and textures and everything are working, and at this stage I could then go in, set up the Google Model Viewer in my Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to include all of my final versions. So here we are. I have everything set up. I just wanted to show you that I actually created a new folder that I called P1 Stuff, because that's the name of the project. In here you can see that I have the index, I have the assets. So if I go into our assets, I've left those HDRs even though we're not really using them. And in the models you can see that I've added all 4. I've got the DVD, the drum, and I've renamed these ones. So the Totadile Sculpt is the cute little one, and the Totadile Box is the one with the texture of the eye. So that's the 4 of them that are there. And what I'm going to do then is I'm going to take that and I'm going to drag it directly into Visual Studio Code. And so in here we can see that all the assets are loaded. Okay. What I haven't done is gone in and done anything to the text itself. So we're going to come in here. We're going to stick with the 500 by 500 since that worked as well as it did. So let's start with the DVD. So we've got the DVD set. I'm going to then save that, and I'm going to maybe just move so I have the 2 of them side by side. There we go. And let's go live. Just scroll that down. Okay, and there's our DVD. So we have our first one working in Google Model Viewer. Our second one is going to be drum. So we switch that, and there's our drum. Again, like I'd go back and adjust those textures, but worked just fine. And then I'm going to switch this to Totadile. Let's do box first, and I did some camel case there. I'm going to save that. There's our Totadile box, and we'll finish up with our Totadile Sculpt. And there we go. So all 4 of our models are loading perfectly into Google Model Viewer, running from Visual Studio Code. You could try running this in Replit too. You'd have to upload your assets. And now, of course, I would want to make 4 different versions of this code, each one named after the different object, upload those to your Phoenix server, and you'd have 4 models all ready to go for your final deliverables. So, what are our takeaways from this tutorial? We covered digital publishing. We looked at a series of effective tools and strategies for sharing your different 3D designs. As we continue learning about 3D modeling, we hope you've enjoyed this series and it has helped expand your confidence in creating 3D designs and publishing them properly.